Most of the men who stormed the beaches of Normandy were barely out of their teens, but one man stood out from everyone else. He was 33 years old, a husband, and a father of 3. As the landing craft rocked in the freezing waters of the English Channel, he wasn't carrying just a rifle and ammunition. He had a bicycle strapped to his back. It sounds unbelievable. Why would anyone invade Hitler's fortress Europe on a bicycle? Was it a mistake, a desperate experiment, or was there a secret plan that history almost forgot? Within the next few hours, hundreds of men would lose their lives, those bicycles would disappear beneath the waves, and one ordinary father would survive one of the bloodiest days in modern history, only to spend the next 50 years refusing to tell anyone what really happened. This isn't the story of a famous general or a decorated war hero whose name appears in every history book. This is the story of an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary moment, whose silence may be just as powerful as the battle itself. Because sometimes the greatest war stories are the ones that were never told. When people imagine D-Day, they usually picture fearless young soldiers charging onto the beaches. Sidney John Bruton wasn't one of them. By the time Europe was consumed by war, Sidney had already built the life most men dreamed of, a wife waiting for him in Bristol, 3 young children who depended on him, and a steady civilian life. Unlike many of the young recruits around him, Sidney had already experienced the responsibilities of fatherhood, and every decision he made carried a different weight. Every risk meant leaving behind people who loved him. When Britain called for more soldiers in 1941, Sidney answered. Not at 18, not at 20, but at 30 years old, an age when many soldiers were already veterans. That alone made him unusual. Most new recruits were years younger, faster, and had far fewer responsibilities waiting back home. Yet none of that mattered once the uniform went on. Like millions of others, Sidney trained day after day, never knowing exactly when or where he would be sent. The war dragged on, and every exercise, every march, and every rifle drill seemed to lead towards something enormous. Rumors spread through military camps. Some believed the Allies would invade France. Others thought they'd attack Norway or even the Balkans, and nobody knew for certain. The officers stayed silent. The soldiers waited, and with every passing month, one question became impossible to ignore. When would the invasion finally begin? Sidney couldn't have known that history had already chosen him for one of the most dangerous missions of the entire war. But before he could step onto the beaches of Normandy, the British Army made one unexpected decision that changed everything. Just weeks before history's biggest amphibious invasion, Sidney's military career took an unexpected turn. He was transferred from the Somerset Light Infantry into the King's Shropshire Light Infantry. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than routine military paperwork. In reality, it completely changed his destiny. The King's Shropshire Light Infantry wasn't just another regiment. Its soldiers had been preparing for something unlike anything the world had ever seen. For months, Britain had quietly transformed its southern coastline into the largest military staging area in history. Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops filled towns, villages, and temporary camps, alongside thousands of tanks, thousands of trucks, and millions of tons of fuel, food, weapons, and ammunition. Every road leading toward the English Channel became crowded with military vehicles. But despite the unbelievable scale of the preparations, secrecy remained absolute. Letters home were censored, troop movements were hidden, and entire areas of southern England became off-limits to civilians. Even many of the soldiers didn't know exactly where they were going. That secrecy wasn't accidental. It was part of one of history's greatest military deception plans. While Sidney and thousands of others secretly prepared to cross the Channel, fake armies were appearing across Britain. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, empty camps designed to fool German reconnaissance, and fake radio messages that filled the airwaves day and night. The operation was so convincing that Adolf Hitler remained convinced the real invasion would strike at Pas de Calais instead of Normandy. Even after Allied troops landed on D-Day, many German commanders still believed Normandy was only a diversion. That single deception would save countless Allied lives. Meanwhile, Sidney continued preparing without knowing just how much depended on absolute secrecy. Every passing day brought him closer to France, closer to danger, closer to the moment that would define his life forever. Then, just when everything was ready, nature threatened to destroy the entire invasion. By early June 1944, nearly every piece was finally in place. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers were preparing to cross the English Channel. Thousands of ships waited offshore, and aircraft filled the skies. It was the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. There was just one problem: the weather. Powerful winds battered the channel, massive waves slammed against landing craft, and dark clouds reduced visibility to almost nothing. For commanders, the decision became agonizing: launch the invasion in terrible conditions, or delay the operation and risk losing the element of surprise. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made one of the most difficult decisions of the entire war and postponed the invasion by 24 hours. For the soldiers waiting to leave England, those extra hours felt endless. Some cleaned their rifles over and over again. Others wrote one final letter home. Many sat in complete silence, lost in their own thoughts, praying, trying to sleep, but most couldn't. No one knew whether they would still be alive by the next sunrise. Then a brief break in the weather appeared. It was small, it was risky, but it was enough. The order was finally given. The invasion would begin. As Sidney climbed aboard his landing craft, surrounded by thousands of other British soldiers, he carried everything he would need for the mission: his rifle, his ammunition, his supplies, and a military bicycle strapped tightly to his back. It looked almost ridiculous, but British planners believed those bicycles could help infantry race inland once the beaches were secured. On paper, it was a brilliant idea. In reality, the sea had other plans. As the first rays of sunlight broke across the English Channel, hundreds of landing craft pushed toward Sword Beach. Inside them, the soldiers waited in silence. No one spoke. The engines roared, the waves crashed against the steel hulls, and every man knew that once the ramp dropped, there would be no turning back. Every soldier had been issued a folding military bicycle. To modern eyes, it sounds almost laughable: a bicycle in the middle of the biggest invasion in history. But military planners had a reason. If the beaches were secured quickly, infantry needed a fast way to move inland before German forces could regroup. Trucks were limited, roads could be blocked, and bicycles required no fuel. They were quiet, lightweight, and could carry soldiers much farther than marching on foot. On paper, the idea was brilliant. Reality didn't care about paper. As the landing craft reached the shore, the ramps crashed into the water. The soldiers stepped forward and immediately realized something was terribly wrong. The sea was much deeper than expected. Instead of running onto sand, many men found themselves chest-deep in freezing water. The weight of their rifles dragged them down. Their heavy backpacks became waterlogged, and the bicycles strapped to their backs suddenly became anchors. Within moments, soldiers were forced to cut them loose just to stay alive. Hundreds of bicycles disappeared beneath the waves before a single wheel ever touched French soil. Years of planning, months of preparation, gone in seconds. But losing the bicycles was the least of their problems, because while the sea swallowed their equipment, German machine guns were already waiting. The moment the first British soldiers reached Sword Beach, the Germans opened fire. Machine guns tore across the sand, mortars exploded without warning, and artillery shells ripped through the air. The peaceful beaches of Normandy instantly became one of the most terrifying places on Earth. Men disappeared beneath explosions. Landing craft burst into flames. Some soldiers never even reached the shore, and others survived the water only to be struck the moment they stood up. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Training took over. Sidney pushed forward with everyone else. Every few seconds brought another explosion, another scream, another life lost. The carefully organized invasion quickly dissolved into chaos. Smoke covered the shoreline. Orders became impossible to hear, and officers searched desperately for scattered units. Still, the British kept advancing. Every bunker captured created another opening, and every machine gun nest destroyed gave hundreds of soldiers another chance to survive. By the end of D-Day, more than 600 men had been killed on Sword Beach alone. Each number represented someone's husband, someone's brother, someone's father. Statistically, Sidney should never have made it off that beach alive. But somehow he did. Most people think surviving D-Day meant surviving the war. They couldn't have been more wrong. The hardest fighting was still ahead. Leaving Sword Beach wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The British 3rd Infantry Division immediately pushed inland toward one of its most important objectives, the city of Caen. Military planners believed it could be captured on the very first day. Instead, it became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Normandy campaign. Waiting for them was the German 21st Panzer Division, with experienced tank crews, veteran infantry, and well-prepared defensive positions. Every village became another battlefield. Every field could hide artillery, and every hedgerow concealed danger. Progress slowed to a crawl. The fighting that commanders expected to last hours stretched into weeks. Sidney continued marching through France alongside thousands of exhausted soldiers. Then came another enormous operation. Operation Market Garden, one of the most ambitious Allied offensives of the entire war. Once again, the King's Shropshire Light Infantry found itself moving into fierce combat, and still, Sidney survived. He crossed Belgium, entered the Netherlands, fought across northwest Europe, and finally reached Germany itself. Very few men who landed on D-Day experienced the entire journey from the beaches of Normandy all the way to the heart of Germany. Thousands were wounded, and thousands never returned home. The 3rd Infantry Division alone suffered thousands of casualties during the campaign, and every passing month reduced the chances of survival. Yet somehow, against overwhelming odds, Sidney kept coming home alive after battle. But the scars left by war aren't always visible. Sometimes the deepest wounds remain completely silent. When the war finally ended, Sidney returned to Bristol. His wife welcomed him home, and his children finally had their father back. Life slowly returned to normal, or at least that's how it looked from the outside. Like countless veterans of the Second World War, Sidney almost never spoke about what he had experienced. Not Sword Beach, not the men who never came home, not the bicycles disappearing beneath the waves, not the months of relentless fighting that followed. His silence lasted for decades. Why? No one can answer that with certainty. Many historians believe some veterans stayed silent because they wanted to protect their families from the horrors they had witnessed. Others simply wanted to leave the war behind and focus on building a peaceful life. Whatever Sidney's reason was, he carried those memories alone. In 1947, another son was born. Bob grew up knowing his father as a quiet family man, never realizing he had survived one of history's greatest invasions. It wasn't until after Sidney passed away in 1992 that the family began uncovering the full story. Old photographs surfaced, along with military medals, regimental badges, and official records, and piece by piece, the remarkable journey finally came back into the light. Without Bob's determination to preserve those memories, the world might never have known Sidney John Bruton's story at all. Today, his life reminds us that history isn't built only by famous generals or celebrated heroes. Sometimes history is carried by ordinary fathers who quietly survived extraordinary days, and who chose to let their actions speak louder than their words.